Welcome, everyone. We continue our series entitled League of Women Voters Empowering You, a program designed by the League of Women Voters in partnership with Dayton Access Television to provide unbiased, nonpartisan information on issues that are relevant to our friends and neighbors throughout the greater Dayton area. My name is David Bodary. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters and your host today as we discuss our topic, Empowering You, Understanding Voter Rights. Our guest today is Dr. Nancy Martorano Miller. She has a Ph.D. from, I knew this.
Rice University.
Rice University, sorry. And actually a master's and Ph.D. from Rice University.
Yes.
But she's an associate professor of political science at the University of Dayton. So welcome.
Thank you for having me today.
Absolutely. Rice University, I'm sorry I forgot that.
It's okay.
So I'm just so pleased to have you with us today, a chance to really gain your insights on voter rights. And voter rights are always important, and the springtime of the year is when we're looking at primary elections typically. So it's a good time to make sure that we are registered to vote and that we understand our rights as voters. So I'm glad that we're able to do this today. Of course, I've read a little bit about your background, and I see that you really focused much of your work on politics in state constitutions.
Yes.
You want to share anything about that?
Sure. So state constitutions are pretty important. We don't think about, many people don't know they exist because they think we have the U.S. Constitution, but each state has its own constitution, which lays out a lot of different rights or additional rights that the U.S. Constitution doesn't provide. And actually the right to vote is in state constitutions, and it really doesn't appear in the U.S. Constitution. There are some protections for voting, outlawing discrimination based on race or gender, setting a minimum age limit, but that statement of a fundamental right to cast a vote in an election is found in every state constitution.
Huh. I don't know that I knew that. Thank you. Well, and as we think about voting itself, we have to think about the process of becoming registered to vote. And
Yes.
of course, the League is great about working with individuals that are interested in becoming registered voters. But there's also been some talk, in fact, our own Secretary of State, Frank LaRose, talked about some version of an automated voter registration process. Do you know anything more about that?
I don't know specifically about the Ohio proposal, but there are about 22 states now that have automatic voter registration, which means once a citizen turns 18, if they've got any engagement, like if they've got a driver's license or have signed up maybe with service, some other type of state service, they'll automatically be registered to vote, and you would have to opt out of being registered, as opposed to now in a lot of states you opt in to being registered.
Right, and certainly in Ohio currently we would need to opt in to becoming registered voters, and the League of Women Voters is happy to help you to do that, for sure.
Yeah.
But your board, let's see, the Bureau of Motor Vehicles might be another place that you could do that, or at the county building.
Right. So
local libraries too?
Local libraries. There are lots of places to get to get registered to vote in Ohio. You can also do it online right now. That's something that's relatively new for Ohio. In the past, you would have to go to the library or the Bureau of Motor Vehicles or come down to your county board of elections and get a paper voter registration form. Now there is a process for filling out that information online.
Okay, so maybe making it a little bit easier. One of those benefits perhaps that comes out of COVID, right, that we begin to recognize, oh, we can do this securely and effectively in an online version, so that's good. What would it take for Ohio to become a more automated state? Do you know?
So there are a couple of different ways that can happen. The easiest way would be probably for the state legislature to pass legislation that would allow for an automated or an automatic voter registration process. I think some of what Secretary LaRose was talking about was maybe a system in which when you go to renew your driver's license at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, right, so part of federal legislation called Motor Voter in the mid-1990s required that states would have a process or a way of registering people to vote when they got a driver's license, renewed a driver's license, or had an interaction with different public agencies.
Right, so that
like
would
Social
include the
Security
Secretary of State.
Secretary of State.
Okay.
And in this automated process, it may be like if you move, that gives you an opportunity to update an address, which I think oftentimes the BMV would ask you, do you want to register to vote at the time you because I mean, one of the things that people do is people move, and oftentimes they don't, one of the things you don't think about when you move is, oh, I need to call the County Board of Elections and tell them I don't live at this address anymore, or I don't live in that state anymore.
Absolutely.
So that is how people do end up registered in multiple states sometimes.
And that was going to be my other question is like, okay, so we maybe have some automated process by which I update my address and therefore my precinct or my district. With what effect? And one effect would be that it then cancels out the old address.
If you're in the same state, probably.
Ah, okay.
If you move from Kentucky to Ohio, probably not. Since these are all 50 separate state registration systems, and we don't have a good system in which the states talk nationally about who's registered to vote where.
Right. I hadn't thought about that. Interesting. All right, so now let's imagine that it's election season and we've got an election maybe ahead of us, and early voting is about to start. So several states, including Ohio, have suggested changes recently to the early voting or the drop box voting or the mail-in voting. Can we talk a bit about that?
Sure.
So how up to date are you in terms of where we stand with some of those things? Do you know what kind of time frame we have for instance, early voting?
So here in Ohio, it's 4 weeks of early voting. So early voting for the May 3rd primary would start in early April in just a couple of weeks. And in the state of Ohio, each county is allowed to have one early voting site. In most places, that's going down to the county election board. So the county board of elections will use their office. Sometimes the bigger county, like in Franklin County, before they officially moved, I think the Franklin County Board of Elections is in an old renovated Kohl's, which is which is good though, because it's very large. It provides a lot of space given there's 1.3 million people in Franklin County.
Gotcha.
And so that has helped cut down sometimes on crowding or lines during the process. Each county is also allowed just a single drop box, which usually has to be somewhere near the county board of elections. In other states, a number of states just in this past year have passed legislation. So like in Maryland, will mandate a certain number of ballot drop boxes per county based on population.
Okay.
To be kind of spread out around the county.
Throughout the
county, so that way you don't have to drive. Like, I live in Franklin County, and I live on the other side of town from the Board of Elections, so it takes a half an hour to drive there if I wanted to drop my ballot off in the ballot box during election season or go to the early voting center.
Right.
And so in Maryland, the intention was to cut down on maybe people having to drive clear across their county or a long distance to be able to cast a ballot early or drop a mail ballot into a ballot box.
Right. And again, these ballot boxes would have to be secure and they would have to be probably monitored in some way in order to ensure the safety and security of that vote. You know, I work right across the street from the county building, and so for me, that wasn't an inconvenience, but I didn't think about what a large county I'm in and how that could be challenging. So it's possible other states have multiple drop boxes.
Yes.
But in Ohio, just one per county.
Just one per county and one early voting site per county, whereas other states have multiple polling sites in a county.
So this might be a recurring question I might ask, but with what effect? Like, in other words, all right, so we get one drop box, we get one early voting site. With what effect? Who does that affect? Who does that impact?
I think it depends on, right, it depends, I think, on how much time you have, right? Ohio has a relatively generous 4-week period in which they're open on Saturdays.
Okay, right.
Throughout that early voting period, and some Sundays. I think one of the changes was cutting down the number of Sundays. It used to be every Sunday during the early voting period. Now it's just the last Sunday. So providing a lot of opportunity for people to fit that into their schedule, which I think is really helpful for voters, because some of us may have family responsibilities, or, I mean, yes, the polls are open from 6:30 a.m. to 7:30 p.m., but for people who might have to work multiple jobs, and if they're in a bigger county living in a more densely populated precinct, the line to vote could be sometimes an hour, 2 hours. They may not have time to wait in line, whereas when you have early voting, an early voting period, or no excuse absentee ballot voting where you can vote by mail simply because that's the choice you want to make, it gives people more opportunities and more flexibility as to when you're going to cast your vote. As opposed to the few places that are left where you can literally only vote on election day.
Right. From the league's perspective, the more people that are able to vote, the better in a democracy that we're in. So from our perspective, then, those early voting opportunities or that mail-in voting opportunity or the absentee voting opportunity, right? In Ohio, we're unrestricted absentee voting state, right?
Yes.
So that really does give a person who's not sure about what's going to happen the second Tuesday of November, hey, maybe I'll be traveling, so maybe I can then vote absentee and I'll have it taken care of ahead of time. Or maybe I've got to worry about my students, my class, my children, my parents, all those things. So how could I take care of it ahead of time? That makes sense. Weekend voting you mentioned, so the Saturday voting continues to be throughout the 4-week early vote process, but I think just the one Sunday. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think those are the big changes that have happened in Ohio. The number of changes that have happened in Ohio recently are not as broad as maybe as would have happened in a few other states.
Right.
Since the 2020 election.
Texas was pretty more, I should say, they were more, what's the right word, stringent or more restrictive in terms of some of the changes in a state like Texas. I haven't paid as much attention to other states. Yeah,
I mean, Texas is a really interesting case because at one point in time, they were at the forefront of early voting. They were one of the first states to kind of have, I think they started out with about an 8-week early voting period. And basically we're opening multiple polling locations around a county. You didn't have to go to a specific one. You just had to be in your county. They were putting them in malls to encourage voting. And now there have been some things that, I mean, the biggest change I think in Texas is with the they have a pretty strict absentee ballot rule in that basically it's open for people who are over age 65 or have a really valid reason why they can't cast their ballot on election day or in person during the voting period. But they've now started to require you to put a partial social security number or partial driver's license number, whichever you use to register to vote, which has caused a pretty significant number of absentee ballot requests to be rejected because people can't remember which one they used.
Ah, right. It's one or the other, but which one? And I can't write them both down.
There were actually some voters that didn't have either because they've been registered to vote for so long that they registered when it wasn't required on a voter registration form.
Right. Wow. I hadn't thought about that. So the other thing we haven't talked about is military vote. And I'm going to throw a curveball at you. So do you know much about the military vote and what their options would be? Here we are in Dayton, Ohio, right?
Right. So there is there's federal law that actually mandates that states have to have a process in place to allow our enlisted citizens and their families that are eligible to vote. And so that involves having earlier deadlines to have ballots set.
Okay.
So they can get them printed and mailed overseas, and then to also give those citizens the ability to have time to fill it out and get it back.
Okay, right. Good. So then, of course, that sort of adds to the complications of delays in getting this whole process started.
Yes.
Right. So as we're kind of trying to wait and watch to see when is this all going to happen. All right, so what are the possible adverse effects of limiting down, for instance, the number of Sundays that a person could vote, or the hours, or other kinds of restrictions? Are there any, and how might you see that?
So, I mean, the downsides of starting to limit things are if people are used to, oh, I have all 4, I mean, Sunday's my day off, and I have all 4 Sundays to get this done. If you're not aware that they took away the first 3 Sundays, you might get caught off guard and find out, oh, you only have 1 opportunity to go. I mean, where we are in terms of in different states to have the flexibility to vote in different ways is really much different than it was decades ago when you got to go vote on election day. In most states, you could get an absentee ballot, but it was a very specific list of reasons why. You either had to be working and not, nowhere near your voting precinct that day, away at school, have a physical disability that would prevent you from getting to the polling place. Sometimes there was an age. Right. I mean, like recently, last election, the Pennsylvania legislature, because of COVID and a number of other things, adopted, no excuse absentee voting, and their state Supreme Court just ruled that unconstitutional because their state constitution literally outlines the reasons why you'd be allowed to have an absentee ballot, which included this very strict list of items.
Gotcha.
So if they want to have no excuse absent, they're going to have to change their constitutional language.
what I hear you saying then is they were able to make that accommodation during a pandemic.
I think they kind of slipped it in there, and then the challenge didn't come up till after the election for some people. I think they wanted to make it a more permanent change and not just a temporary. A lot of states did all mail-in, like California did all mail-in or absentee voting because of the pandemic. Hawaii, starting with this primary season, is moving to all mail-in voting. They won't do in-person voting anymore. Oh, wow. So it'll be similar to Oregon, where they do all mail-in voting.
So I'm trying to imagine why Hawaii might do that, but one of the reasons would be staffing of the polling places, right?
Yeah, some of it's practical, it's staffing. You don't have to worry about staffing polling places on Election Day. On the few places that have moved to all mail-in voting, they've actually found turnout actually increases a little bit. If people can get the booklet at home, have time to look at it and send it in, as opposed to, it's not a huge increase in turnout, but it's a small increase in turnout. And so some states are trying to think about, well, what are ways that we can encourage people to vote and increase the number of people participating on Election Day, which is really the important thing for democracy, is that as many people participate that are eligible, that are possible.
I'm so glad you said it. I didn't have to. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that Frank LaRose would be welcoming to any person that thought they wanted to help work the polls. And there are opportunities for individuals to help work the polls on Election Day. So if you're thinking, maybe you're a high school student and you're thinking, I'd like to do that, pretty sure that seniors, it could be juniors and seniors, are made available to be able to do that. But even if you're a senior citizen and you're thinking, boy, I'd really like to be able to see how this process works, and I could help by sitting at the polling station, there will be a need. And we can tell just by the staffing needs that we see at the local restaurants and coffee shops that the staffing need will be the same on polling day.
Yeah, I definitely. The last few elections, it's been a really hard task to get enough poll workers. And if you don't have enough poll workers, then you won't be able to have as many voting machines operating in a precinct, which will lead to longer lines in a lot of places.
And there's my question again, with what effect, right? Because then who has to wait longer? Can they afford to wait? Does their vote end up maybe getting left because simply they didn't have the hour to wait and they had to get to work or get to the daycare or whatever? So yeah, I think having enough people to be able to work those polling locations, or taking advantage of the absentee, what's the right word? No
excuse
absentee ballot, so that you could take care of that voting ahead of time. Absolutely. All right, so now let's imagine that we weren't in Ohio, that we were maybe in a new state that didn't exist, and we could make up any rule that we wanted. Are there any creative ways that you could suggest that we think differently about this process? I mean, sometimes we hear people say, oh, we ought to make Election Day a national holiday, and that would solve all the problems and everybody be available. But maybe that's not a great solution either. Are there other ideas that we're not thinking about that you could suggest or throw out?
This one's a little bit of a curveball. I haven't really thought about that. I'm not sure there are creative solutions in terms of like really fundamentally changing the way we go about casting votes, but maybe more education and promotion about why it's important to go vote.
Absolutely.
Like rebuilding civic education amongst the population, in which, it's a right. The right to vote's a fundamental right in our state constitutions, but it's also a responsibility and a duty. As citizens, our choices at the ballot box is really the primary way in which we give our consent to a group of people to govern us and make public policies. And if we don't go and vote, we're really not giving our consent.
We're not fully participating.
We're not fully participating.
Right.
So, it's a right we have. And, on the one hand, I respect somebody's belief that if they don't feel like the government respects them, they feel disconnected and they're not going to vote in protest. But the problem or the issue with that is when you choose not to vote out of protest, those elected officials don't know that's why you didn't vote. Because people sometimes just vote because they're apathetic and don't care. And so those elected officials don't feel like they have to be responsive to people who don't vote.
Right. I totally get that, and my viewers certainly will recognize that I talk a lot about how democracy is not a spectator sport. This isn't like football where I get to watch and see those people interacting out there. This is where I need to take an active role. And so my vote is an opportunity to do that. But so is my poll working as another way to actively, or maybe it's volunteering with my local league to help get people registered to vote and things like that. I have one other, I hope it's not a tricky question, but I've heard that Alaska is doing something called ranked choice voting. Can you explain what that is? Do you know?
I know what it is. I'm going to try to see if I can explain it in a very easy, forward way, because it tends to confuse people. I'd like to think about it as an automatic runoff, right? There are some states, like I think probably the one everybody can think of easily is Georgia in 2020 with their Senate race. Where some states you can win your seat with a plurality of votes, meaning you just get the most votes of all the people running. In other states, you need a majority, 50% plus one, and that Georgia is one of those states. And so in both those Senate races in 2020, none of the candidates there were like 3 candidates running in each race, none of them got 50%, so they had to do a runoff with the top 2 candidates. Ranked choice voting in a lot of ways is like an automatic runoff. So instead of having to take the top 2 and then schedule an election in another month or so, when you go in, so it requires that you need a 50% threshold to win, so it can't just be a plurality. When you go and vote, instead of voting for one candidate, you might vote for 2 candidates, your first choice and your second choice. Gotcha. And it depends on how the governing entity that the election is going to say could be the top 3 choices.
I'm with you.
Right. So then everybody votes and they see how it shakes out. And if you've got 3 candidates and, one gets 40%, the other gets 40%, so that's 80%, and the other gets 20%, the candidate who gets the 20%, they're out of the running. And then they look at everybody who voted for that third candidate. They see who they listed as the second choice.
Okay.
So if we think way back into the 1990s, when you had Bill Clinton versus George H.W. Bush versus Ross Perot, right. I suspect most Ross Perot voters would have preferred George H.W. Bush to win the presidency than Bill Clinton. But what happened is
they took their votes away.
Right, they took their votes away, which then gave Bill Clinton a plurality. If they had had ranked choice voting, George H.W. Bush may have won because he would have been a lot of Perot voter second choices.
Gotcha. And so probably we don't think of that as often at the presidential level, but you could see that regularly, right? If we were to just vote across the board in terms of who do I want to have for my congressperson in Ohio or something like that, where you could have.
Right, and it really only, I think we don't see it a lot in the United States. It happens in a lot of other countries where you have multiple parties, right? Since we have 2 primary parties, most races will be a Democrat versus a Republican. This might come into play if you have an independent candidate running, which doesn't happen very frequently in most elections.
Yeah, well, thank you. So I'm going to set one more scenario, and that is that often my students say that they feel like, oh, voting doesn't really matter. And yet, I think it really does matter. I'm wondering, from your perspective, how do you help your students at UD or the other people that you meet to understand how to overcome that feeling of like hopelessness or helplessness?
I think what I talk a lot about, I go back into history and I talk a lot about the consent argument that political philosophers talk about when they talk about the founding of the United States and why we have elections. That the reason why we go and have elections is because this is where we're giving our consent to be governed. And yes, your candidate may not win. You may end up in a place in which the legislature is controlled by the opposite party of what you would prefer. And then I said, but at least if you went and voted, you can retain your right to complain.
Yeah, there you go.
Right. So if you didn't vote because you don't have a right to walk around and complain about that you don't like what you've got, right? So you have to participate. And so I try to instill upon them that this is an important process and that at any given time you might get the outcome you want. And if you you're never going to get change if you're disconnected from it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. And of course, we can turn to a number of elections that were won or lost by a vote or 2. And so they do matter, absolutely do matter. We live in a democracy that's messy and challenging and polarized. Our democracy requires us to be engaged, active, not passive bystanders. It starts obviously by becoming a registered voter, and we've talked about how you can do that. And if you're not sure, you can contact the League. But then it continues as we educate ourselves to vote, and I appreciate your education of us here today. There's a lot of work that needs to be done still as we continue to work actively and create that more perfect union, and I appreciate the efforts that you've made to do so. Is there anything else that you'd like to share?
I'm not sure there's anything I'd like to other than go get registered and go vote, participate. The minimum thing we can all do is go and vote and cast our vote for what our preferred candidates and policies are. And if you have the time, get more involved in, serving as a poll worker, or if you have the time and the inclination, work for candidates that you would like to see elected to office.
That's so important, and I appreciate you mentioning that. And while the League is nonpartisan, we're not going to take sides or whatever. That doesn't mean that we don't encourage people to become active with candidates. And there's lots of candidates that would love to have some help, whether that's knocking on doors and handing out flyers, or whether that's making phone calls or whatever. Mm-hmm. So that's really, really important. That's what I've got. Anything else?
No, I think that's it. Thank you for having me.
So I am going to go ahead and close. We want to thank our guest, Dr. Nancy Martorano Miller. She is an associate professor of political science at the University of Dayton. I've really enjoyed our conversation. The League of Women Voters encourages everyone to participate in the upcoming election and every election. If you have any further questions about this or upcoming programs, you can contact the League by emailing us at league@lwvdayton.org. That's league@lwvdayton.org. Or you can call the office at 937-228-4041. I want to thank you for being with us tonight. Thank you, Nancy.
Thank you.
I appreciate your time. And be active in our political system. Be an active voter, but also be engaged.